This is another iRaw podcast.
Well, marginalization has health consequences, and health lends itself to being a marginalizing apparatus. As with the definition of who is part of collectives treated as end and not just as means, health issues are permeated by biopolitical decisions. Who can have health? Who should have health? Who says what health is and how it should be cared for?
Welcome back to Season 7 of the Animal Tone podcast, where we are focused in on multi-species health. We are now officially halfway through the season, yay! And in today's episode, we're going to focus on marginalized multi-species collectives. My guest today is Oswaldo Santos Baquero, who's a professor in the Department of Preventive Veterinary Medicine and Animal Health at the School of Veterinary Medicine in the University of São Paulo, as well as the Peripheries Research Group at the Institute of Advanced Studies. He also coordinates the Multispecies Health Network, the MUHE Network, which is dedicated to the reproduction of the good life of marginalized multispecies collectives, our concept in focus today. Oswaldo has a degree in veterinary medicine, a PhD in epidemiology, and a post-doctorate that is focused on public health. He works with and has published on matters related to decolonisation, biopolitics, political ecology, as well as science and technology studies. Now, you might have noticed that today's episode is particularly long, and part of the reason for this is because Oswaldo was slightly uncomfortable with his English and asked if we could do a more scripted interview. So I asked a few questions, and then I handed over to Oswaldo, who primarily read from a script he had prepared ahead of time. Now, this is not normally what we do on The Animal Tone, but it's vitally important to get views from varied geographies on the show, and part of doing this means creating space for these exchanges to happen across language barriers. Oswaldo gives some pretty dense theoretical and observational insights into what he thinks constitutes a marginalized multi-species geography and why it's important that we should also focus on peripheries when thinking about health. Priya also joins us again on the Animal Highlight to tell us about Sammy, a dog whose story encapsulates dimensions of what a marginalized multi-species collective entails. Just a reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E. The season is sponsored by the Remaking One Health Indies project, and this episode is jointly sponsored by the Phoenix Zones Initiative. You can also support the show via Patreon, Buzzsprout, or Buy Me a Coffee. Alternatively, you can support us through our merch store by buying one of the products with incredible designs by Rebecca Shen, or you can leave a review wherever you listen. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Oswaldo. Welcome to the Animal Tone podcast. It's going to be exciting to talk to you today about marginalized multi-species collectives. I'm very much looking forward to it. But as always in the show, let's get started with learning a little bit about you. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in animals?
For sure, Claudia, and thank you for inviting me. I'm currently in São Paulo, Brazil. I have lived here for 14 years. And to give you an idea, the entrance to my house has a 7-meter long fence, barely perceptible between the leaves of a climbing plant. Behind it is a garden with banana trees and Atlantic forest vegetation, a type of small tropical forest. What follows is the building with the living room, kitchen, bathroom, and bedrooms. At the back is another garden with fruit trees and vegetable patch. The diversity of arthropods that live in the garden is significant. They actually enter the other areas of the house. The birds that come are also varied. There are even some sarwes, a kind of opossum, that come at night and sometimes live in the roof lining. In the house also live a cat, my partner Eva, and our 7-year-old daughter Maya. In terms of certain stereotypes about tropics and Brazil, it may seem like an ordinary house. However, it should be noted that São Paulo is the largest metropolis in Brazil and in all of America, the fourth most populated city in the planet. It is a city dominated by concrete, high-rise buildings, cars, and a scarcity of green areas. My house is quite unusual in that it doesn't have a garage, and the lush garden make it even more unusual. However, it is not just the house that deviates from São Paulo's standard. The middle-class neighborhood is also very particular. Its green areas contrast with the gray that prevails in the rest of the city. This particularity is not coincidence. It is the result of another characteristic of the neighborhood, the collective organization in defense of common good, which tries to resist the neoliberal onslaught that seeks to turn every corner of the city into a source of profit. I, Maya, and especially Eva are involved in the neighborhood's community initiatives. The University of São Paulo, another huge place with a community of 120,000 people, is also located in the neighborhood. I work there. I am professor of epidemiology and public health at the School of Veterinary Medicine and the Institute for Advanced Studies. In the vicinity of my neighborhood and the university is the São Remo favela, a slum, a community with a very powerful history of resistance and collective organization. I have been following and trying to contribute to the community's initiatives for about 6 years now. So the network I coordinate at the university, the Multispecies Health Network. Much of the work I have been doing in the Multispecies Health Network has to do with the intersection of other than human living beings and urban peripheries. And this is no coincidence either. I was born and grew up on the urban periphery of Bogotá, Colombia, another South American metropolis. Like many other people from the periphery, I know practically nothing about the history of my grandparents. But I do know that my maternal grandmother came from a family that lived off subsistence farming before being fragmented by violence associated with land grabbing and concentration. As a child, my grandmother had to flee and end up in the city alone. Although she remains in Bogotá until now, she has maintained an emotional bond with her rural origins. When I was a child, I enjoyed going to her house, among other things, because it always had animals. She often visited her homeland or was visited by family members. These trips were used to bring wild animals into the city, especially turtles and birds. Before I was born, she even had a monkey and a deer. She kept chickens for consumption, and discovering this was shocking for me. I remember a sheep I saw growing up, and one day after having lunch, I realized that the meat I was eating was him.
That must have been a shock, I'm sure.
Yes. I also remember family outings where she brought live chicken and then slaughtered them to prepare the meal. It was shocking for most of the family, as she was the only one who had rural background. On the other hand, dogs were becoming more popular as pets in the city. I got fascinated every time I saw a dog. And once I saw a street dog entangled in a rope. He cried a lot, and the more he tried to escape, the more trapped he got. I was very distressed and didn't know how to help him, until luckily an adult arrived and managed to free him. My grandmother stopped keeping wild animals, and my contact with other species ended up being restricted to urban fauna. We had dogs at home, and I couldn't be indifferent to the ones I saw on the streets. In my adolescence and early adulthood, I was heavily influenced by urban culture, but also by indigenous cultures. I ended up studying veterinary medicine at the National University of Colombia, where these influences continue. It was very difficult to complete the degree. I did well academically, but the systematic violence against animals used in teaching was difficult to bear and to counter. The ideological insistence on naturalizing and normalizing the use of animals was pervasive. Then I came to Brazil and did a PhD in which I took a demographic and epidemiological approach to the population management of companion animals. I went on to do a postdoctorate in public health, and I am currently a professor of epidemiology and public health at the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of São Paulo, where, as I said, I coordinate the Multispecies Health Network.
Yeah, I've looked at some of your work on the Multispecies Health Network online, and it's really fascinating and interesting. And, on the show, we've spoken a number of times to vets and people who have done veterinary medicine and who have, I think, in many ways said similar things to you, that undertaking that degree can be really traumatizing in its own way. And sometimes the intensity of the requirements of the degree, like you said, it's not easy. The intensity of the requirements can almost make you dull to the kind of suffering that's happening and the things you have to do. So really interesting, but I couldn't help in listening to you talk about your home, and your home in Sao Paulo reflect a little bit on what my home looked like in South Africa. So I'm from South Africa, and currently I'm in Europe. And I think when I tell people in South Africa and people here that in South Africa we have big fences everywhere, that's really shocking for them. And they always think this really just different idea of South Africa, that it's green and that there are many animals. But I come from Johannesburg, a big city like Sao Paulo in many ways, but also very different. So a really fascinating backstory there about your connections and how you've moved through your academic degree. But today we're going to be talking about a very specific concept, and that's marginalized multispecies collective. Before we get to the marginalized, maybe we can just start with, what is a multispecies collective?
Okay, let's look at each of these words in order to say something about this expression. A collective is nothing more than a group or collection of entities. Thus, a multispecies collective is a group of several species. The most common connotation of species is that of biological taxonomy. When living beings are classified according to a hierarchy, the species is the basic unit of categorization, also used as a measure of biodiversity. The idea is that all organisms of a species have approximate ancestor in common, which in taxonomic terms is equivalent to saying that they are of the same genus. In turn, all organisms in a genus are from the same family, and so on. A domestic cat is of the species Felis catus, of the genus Felis, and the family Felidae. In this sense, a group of trees, birds, and worms is a multispecies collective, in the same way as a collective of cows and humans exploited in a slaughterhouse, or a group of mice and humans in a research laboratory. However, it should be noted that the classification of life into discrete categories of a hierarchical classification is nothing more than an attempt to order life by fitting into a model created in recent Western history. It is an ordering schema that allows us to understand many things, but also limits understanding when it is taken as the right and only order that can be seen in life. What's more, this order in which we try to fit life has several impasses. Let's think about a common definition of species. The largest group whose members have characteristics in common and in which two organisms of the appropriate sex or reproductive type are also able to generate fertile offspring. To begin with, this definition does not apply to organisms that reproduce asexually. In genetic terms, a hierarchical system in which the connection between species is solely through common ancestors is incompatible with the horizontal gene transfer, which happens when genes move from one organism to another who is not her offspring. Horizontal gene transfer occurs between very dissimilar species. There are even expressions that refer to cases in which this definition of species is problematic. For example, aggregates of microspecies, species complexes, ring species, quasi-species, among others. In addition, there are dozens of other definitions which resolve some inconsistencies but run into others. In The Origin of Species, Darwin wrote, "No one definition has satisfied all naturalists. Yet every naturalist knows vaguely what he means when he speaks of a species." Today, imprecision continues to challenge efforts to order living beings into discrete categories. Whatever the definition, a species is a collective of living beings. If a collective is a group with several entities, the opposite tends to be defined as that which is one, an individual, a non-divisible entity. This lends itself to think of the living members of a species as individuals. You and me are living members of the human species. But are each of us a single entity? Our bodies have more bacterial cells than human eukaryotic cells. The relationship between these cells co-produces embryological, physiological, and immunological processes on which we depend. So we too are multispecies collectives. It is not different with other living beings. They are multispecies collectives co-produced between and through another multispecies collectives. A word that allows us to refer to such collectives without reducing them to individuals or unitary entities is holobionts. Donna Haraway clearly summarizes this complexity when she says, "Critters interpenetrate one another, loop around and through one another, eat each other, get indigestion, and partially digest and partially assimilate one another, and thereby establish symbiotic arrangements that are otherwise known as cells, organisms, and ecological assemblages." On the other hand, the connotation of the term species is not only biological. This is perhaps clearest in Portuguese and Spanish, languages in which species is often used in place of kind and type. But in English, we also talk about things that are special cases precisely because of this connotation. So we can think of multispecies collectives made up of living and non-living entities. This is interesting because it shows that multispecies collectives are also environments, territories. Returning to the example of our body, isn't it also an environment inhabited by countless microorganisms and a territory framed by biopolitical regimes? Here I can't help but think of feminists and indigenous thinkers who talk about hyphenated bodies, territories. The complexity and plurality of multispecies collectives materialize and make sense in specific situations. While it is appropriate to refer to multispecies collectives abstractly, it's also necessary to define partial ad hoc compositions of multispecies collectives involved in a given situation. For instance, mineral extraction from a forest causes deforestation and pollution that affects multispecies collectives in various ways. The composition and agency of these collectives is extremely complex, and the task of detailing the process that emerged from the relationship between mining and these collectives is inexhaustible. But at the same time, a situated approach can work with a collective of, for example, human children and fish of a particular species that live in the territory to determine the toxic effects of mercury and articulate forms of resistance against the extractivism that feeds and the commodification of life.
Some of what you said makes me think a little bit about things like actor network theory and biocentrism, which I know I've had some criticisms of on the podcast in the past. I sometimes struggle, I think, a little bit with biocentrism. But if I understand you correctly, I think you're saying that multi-species collectives as a concept is a way of acknowledging both the limitations and opportunities of thinking about species and animal relations also as concepts, because species is an improper kind of term as well. We think it's normal and natural, but actually it's much more fluid and complex than what many of us think. And then multi-species collectives as a concept allows us to appreciate that individuals, at whatever scale you want to talk about that, so whether it's a microbe or a human, individuals are embedded inside collectives, and that collectives exist at a variety of scales. So whether it's microbial collectives or mammalian collectives or mammal fish collectives. And I mean, it seems to me that geography is quite important here in terms of how you maybe are defining how you look at collectives. But implicitly, it seems that you're challenging both the concepts of species and of individuals by showing that both concepts are perhaps necessarily ambiguous and have flaws. Would you agree? Is that kind of a fair assessment?
Yes, if we want to think in terms of individuals and scales, it's one way of looking at multispecies collectives.
I can't help but think in scales. I'm trained as a geographer, so it just naturally comes up for me. All right, so does multi-species collective then challenge the tendency of thinking about animal relations, often exclusively through the lens of individuals and or species? So are you trying to challenge this tendency of focusing on animal relations through the lens of individuals and or through the lens of species?
Yes, but not necessarily. In order to work with the idea of multispecies collectives, we don't need to presuppose that individuals are the fundamental unit of life and precede the relationships they establish with each other, in such a way that species is the secondary result of a certain type of reproductive relationship between individuals. We can do without this assumption or problematize it, as I suggested earlier. This is important as part of the political production of other vocabularies and grammars that allow us to think and act differently and in accordance with the challenges of the catastrophic times we are experiencing. However, the notions of multispecies collective, individual, and biological species are not incompatible, and this is also important. In order to respond adequately to catastrophic times, we need to act in concrete situations, which have their own vocabularies and grammars for organizing and making sense of living experiences. In order to incorporate the notion of multispecies collectives into these situations, a practical and simple meaning is initially decisive, and this can involve the notions of individual and biological species. For instance, when we start to talk about multispecies collectives in favelas and other peripheries, we use expressions that can implicitly be mapped on the usual meaning of individual and biological species. In Brazilian urban peripheries, it is common to talk about communities or even as a synonym for urban periphery. It is also common to talk about organized groups working for the common good as collectives. We have been able to convey an initial notion of multispecies collective by saying that a collective is nothing more than a group or community whose members are not only human. In a given favela, for instance, there may be humans, dogs, cats, rats, pigeons, scorpions, cockroaches, trees, and small plants, among others. All these living beings form a group, community, or multispecies collective. Although we are talking about members or living beings rather than individuals, and not all these categories mentioned here are exactly a biological species. After all, there are several species of rats, scorpions, and trees. At first, some people tend to refer to the idea of individual and biological species, but progressively, these ideas can become more complex. We can even find interesting conceptions of what is an individual. I am thinking of what Karen Barat calls interaction. For her, the phenomena that make up the world are particular material relations that are not restricted to humans. It is within these phenomena that the properties and limits that define what we call individuals emerge and make sense. Thus, rather than being an interaction between two or more pre-existing indivisibles, the existence of individuals emerge and is situated in an entanglement of interactions. Individuals are always relatives. In other words, in relation. They are implemented and constituted by an entanglement of forces by interactions.
Karen Barad's been used a couple of times on the show, and I hear you. So we're never really, to be human or to be a being is often to be in relation. So the idea of being kind of isolated and alone it's a bit of a fallacy. It's something that's difficult to comprehend. And I really appreciate what you said there about needing, what did you say? We need to look at our own vocabularies and grammars for organizing and making sense of living experiences. And this certainly seems like it's also an empirical question, how people would talk about multi-species collectives in the favelas where you are might be different to how people talk about multi-species collectives in Vienna, or how people might, and even then different people in the favelas and different people in Vienna would have different vocabularies and ideas for thinking about these collections. But then this brings me to the other word that's in consideration today, and that's marginalized. In your work with Multispecies Health Network, you seem to focus not only on multispecies collectives, but on a very specific type of collective, marginalized multispecies collectives. So what is a marginalized multispecies collective and why is it important?
Let's now look at marginalization from a biopolitical and political ecology perspective. Who is part of a given collective? Who decides what the composition of that collective is and what are the implications for those inside and outside it? In biopolitics, the term apparatus refers to the arrangement of discursive and non-discursive practices, institutions, and artifacts that make it possible to manage, control, and shape collectives. Apparatuses marginalize when they establish and legitimize margins that distinguish between lives with intrinsic value and lives with instrumental value whose interests matter little or not at all. Those who draw the margins arrogate to themselves the prerogative of deciding who is worth more and who is worth less. In this way, they legitimize biopolitical regimes to maintain their privileges by exploiting marginalized lives, relegated to symbolic and geographical peripheries. Racism, patriarchy, cis heteronormativity, and classism are among the many marginalizing apparatuses, as are colonialism, speciesism, and animalization. Animalization is a marginalizing apparatus that establishes a category of beings that can be exploited for human benefit. It is applied to other than human animals, but also to certain humans. As I mentioned in a publication, as recently as 1920, the Wildlife Conservation Society, the same institution that decades later proposed the One Health concept, was responsible for exhibiting Ota Benga, a young black man, at the Bronx Zoo. Animalization is structural to racism, a way of creating subhumans who can be legitimately oppressed to satisfy the desires of those who set themselves up as superior humans. Even if it is not as explicit as it once was, the animalization of humans continue to operate through language and its fundamental role in creating technologies of inferiorization and oppression of humans. The interaction between marginalizing apparatuses is not restricted to racism and animalization. They feed back on each other in complex ways, which is why the idea of intersectionality as work on by Black feminism is relevant and needs to be expanded. Schematically, the marginalization suffered by a Black woman is not equivalent to the marginalization of Black men plus the marginalization of white women. The simultaneous operation of marginalizing apparatuses results in specific ways of living, falling ill, and dying. All living beings can, dynamically, be relatively marginalized by one apparatus and relatively privileged by another. For example, a Somali boy, despite being human and male, can suffer from food insecurity and neglected health problems, while a cat living in Switzerland, despite being female and not human, can receive high-quality food and the best healthcare available. Being porcine and female is often a sentence of extreme perpetual confinement. A healthy breeding bull that has been well cared for can be killed and replaced by another if it develops certain diseases or become too old. Despite the ecology of violence that affects marginalized multispecies collectives, the living beings that make them up learn tactics of resistance, survival, and friction through peripheral pedagogies. The creativity and capacity for reinvention of marginalized multispecies collectives is well illustrated by the indigenous peoples of A.P.P.L.E, the continent that white colonizers came to call America. These peoples and their multispecies collectives, through their peripheral pedagogies, have resisted colonial brutality for more than 5 centuries. Of course, not all marginalized multispecies collectives have been able to resist. After all, we are at the beginning of the 6th mass extinction. What is lost with extinctions is much more than biodiverse mass. We also lose ways of life. When a species disappears, the relationships it made possible are lost, as are the ways of living and seeing the world of its members. There's a situation told by philosopher Juliana Fausto that it is interesting to think about disappearing. She talks about the construction of Brasilia, the capital of Brazil. The building construction of the modern project was carried out by migrant workers from the northeast of the country in very precarious conditions. When they were leveling an area, they found some rat nests that turned out to be of an unknown genius. One day, there was a disagreement between the workers in the company canteen. The police intervened, and then there were reports of lorries carrying bodies and 93 suitcases that were not claimed by the owners the next day. The bodies of the murdered workers were never found. Of the rats declared extinct, only 8 bodies were found. The way they lived and the world they had built was lost, buried by the modern city. That's why Juliana says, if development is one of the engines of the Anthropocene, then the massacre of subhuman and non-human populations is its fuel. We need peripheral pedagogies to learn how to break margins and live in other ways.
Yeah, we need them to, we kind of have a status quo and an established way of thinking about the ways in which humans and animals interact, and peripheral pedagogies can help to, I guess, challenge the established ways of thinking about it, but also enrich and enliven in distinct ways. And, also, whenever I think about intersectionality, I think it's also important to realize how one's intersection or interaction, as you said earlier, can shift depending on who they're talking with and where they're talking. So as a white woman from South Africa, my race often privileged me in interactions in South Africa, whereas maybe my gender did not. But then in other situations or places, my gender might actually be a benefit or an assistance to me in helping to achieve a particular goal because of that kind of collective, that social collective. So going back to your point of just how important context is in thinking about how these relationships work and these violences work. And it makes me think a lot about this, about the concept of entangled oppressions. I think I first heard it from David Nybert, but it's very similar to a lot of what you're saying here about how oppression is entangled. And some other ideas came to mind as you were talking. So the first related to who would be considered privileged versus marginalized in a given environment or ecology. Earlier, you mentioned how our bodies consist of multi-species collectives. Could my eating poorly, right? So thinking about the microbes in my body, could my eating poorly be thought of as marginalizing their needs? Or what about if we remove humans from the equation for a bit and just think about animal relations? could predators be thought of as marginalizing the needs of the animals who they prey on? And this is a common argument that's put against vegans, and I've got my own thoughts about it. I think it's pretty tricky terrain. But what are your thoughts?
Let's remember that a marginalizing apparatus is a set of discursive and not discursive practices, institutions, and artifacts mobilized to administer collectives with the aim of conferring privileges to those who arrogate to themselves the role of administrators through the legitimized exploitation of those who are administered. If we look at the ultra-processed food industry, for instance, we will find an arrangement of institutions, operations, and discourses to legitimize the profits of an oligopoly, systematically disguising the damage caused by this type of food system. In this sense, the provision of inadequate food is a form of marginalization. If, on the other hand, we imagine a scenario restricted to a single person eating poorly, it becomes more difficult to think in terms of marginalization. First, we will have to consider that on the one hand there is a person and on the other their microbiota. Second, we would have to assume that this person, by eating poorly, is mobilizing marginalizing apparatuses to take advantage of the exploitation of this microbiota. In the case of other than human predators, I also find it difficult to think that it is the case of a collective that is using marginalizing apparatuses to legitimize the exploitation of its prey.
Yeah, this is definitely tricky terrain. But earlier on I asked you, so we've got marginalized multi-species collectives, and you mentioned that they are marginalized because there's, I guess, structural forces that are both discursive and non-discursive. And it's not just an individual that's marginalized, but an entire collective that's marginalized. And you mentioned extinction earlier, and this is often why people will cite why we have to intervene and protect animals. So then I just want to come back to the second part of that question. Why is it important to look at marginalized collectives?
What I just said in the previous answer is one of the reasons why it's important to look at these collectives. We need peripheral pedagogies to learn how to break margins and live in other ways. This is a matter of survival because the modern Western way of life is unsustainable. If all humans had the consumption patterns of the elites of the global north, we would need several planets full of resources. Even today's consumption patterns, and even considerably lower ones, are incompatible in the long term with a planet with finite resources and regenerative processes that take place on different time scales. The marginalization of multispecies collectives is a condition of possibility for capitalist modernity, whose principle is the accumulation of wealth and unlimited progress. Many marginalized multispecies collectives, in their finiteness, are pushed to their limits in order to extract maximum profitability from them. This is particularly clear in the case of animals industrialized to make them food commodities, to the precarious labor that marginalized people have to endure. For this reason, deconstructing marginalizing apparatuses is an indispensable task in order to chart other courses and make other ways of life possible. Beyond survival strategies, looking at marginalized multispecies collectives is of the utmost importance because it is a question of justice. There are various ways of understanding justice, and the capabilities approach developed by Martha Nussbaum is one way of dealing with justice from a multispecies perspective, focusing on sentient beings. Dignity, intuitively conceived, is a key idea in the capabilities approach. Living beings with diverse capacities to carry out activities that are good for them have dignity when they are treated as ends and not only as means, without being prevented from realizing these capacities. And where dignity is lacking, justice fails. The living beings perceive and evaluate the world. They experience it relationally, discriminating some things as beneficial and others as harmful. As active living beings, they give value to plural goods, take an interest in them, and endeavor to enjoy them. Capabilities are basic goods. Justice requires that all capabilities be guaranteed at least at a minimum level, without compensating for deficiencies in some with an excess of others. Since the realization of capabilities depend on a network of agencies, justice cannot be reduced to the treatment of isolated individuals. In this context, marginalization has a significant impact on the opportunities that creatures have to live in dignity. The capabilities approach poses the challenge of deciding which living beings are sentient and what is the minimum in terms of capabilities that we should guarantee for a given species. In other words, it is an approach that extends the sphere of moral consideration beyond humans, but at the same time delimits this sphere and therefore updates the marginalizing potential of the institution of limits by deciding who can and cannot suffer injustice and what this suffering consists of. It's an unavoidable challenge, but not one to be faced in any way. Good intentions do not guarantee justice, while some decisions taken in the name of the common good can end up being harmful to someone. For this reason, the establishment of the frontiers of justice, as well as the solutions presented in the name of justice, named to be provisional and, above all, continually problematized.
Okay, so analytically and conceptually, thinking of human and animal groups, especially vulnerable ones, as multi-species collectives is important because failing to think about animals and their many relations is, in and of itself, an injustice. Add to that a failure to think across these relations and how it's contributing to massive global challenges like climate change and extinction. But you would argue that even if they are imperfect, we need to have frontiers of justice. Is this, I don't know, like this makes me think a little bit of the Universal Human Declaration of Rights. Imperfect, but necessary to make sure that even the most vulnerable are heard and considered. Is what you're saying here something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
There are some similarities between the capabilities approach and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In both cases, dignity is a core component, and it is assumed that there is a minimum set of requirements to guarantee it. There are even partial overlaps between these requirements in the case of humans. Although I'm not well acquainted with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it seems to me that the guiding principle of the Declaration is not the guarantee of opportunities to exercise basic capabilities.
Interesting. And so how can you determine who is marginalized and what challenges come with doing so?
In many cases, I think it's quite obvious. Think of agribusiness, whose main objective is to accumulate capital through the production of food commodities. To do this, it industrializes and tortures billions of animals and exploits human workers to the point of producing situations analogous to slavery, as happens in Brazil and other countries. In the process, it destroys countless wild multispecies collectives and their habitats. It has a lot of suffering and planetary destruction to enrich a handful of corporations. But there are other circumstances that are not obvious in which, although we can better situate ourselves by problematizing marginalizing apparatuses and defining species-specific capabilities to be guaranteed, it's not possible to assume a comfortable position. In any case, we need a lot of empathy, caution, and persistence to dynamically update our responses to identify and work for those who need it most.
Yeah, I hear you. So, I mean, in some cases, like you say, it is obvious, the destruction of the Amazon rainforest to serve agribusiness is a clear example of multi-species collectives and areas that are struggling in response to the demands of meat eating, soy production, and agribusiness. I suppose in some situations it's maybe less obvious, especially as politics get involved, You could think about rats in cities and how extermination campaigns have often been leveled against rats, which have then included things like poisons that have hurt numerous other animals, not just rats. But then people would say, well, this is done in service of protecting public health, keeping humans' health, for example. And this brings me back to thinking a little bit about our focus for this season. And if we could come back to that for a minute, which is multi-species health. How is the concept of marginalized multi-species collective connected to the question of health?
Well, marginalization has health consequences, and health lends itself to being a marginalizing apparatus. As with the definition of who is part of collectives treated as end and not just as means, health issues are permeated by biopolitical decisions. Who can have health? Who should have health? Who says what health is and how it should be cared for? Who is heard when say something? Let's think about the relationship between health and the marginalization of multispecies collectives, taking the example of poultry industrialized for the production of meat and eggs in Brazil. Brazil's Ministry of Health is the government sector responsible for healthcare. However, it doesn't look after the health of industrialized poultry. This is done by the Ministry of Agriculture, which has a national poultry health program. So, not all health phenomena are looked after by the Ministry of Health. The reason for this is clear. What is meant by poultry health in the political sphere is fundamentally something that needs to be guaranteed so as not to jeopardize the economic value of the commodities produced from the bodies of the birds. Poultry medicine books and articles are predominantly aimed at preventing the collapse of poultry in the face of so-called production diseases. Treatments therefore seek to ensure that the birds resist the pressures of the exploitation systems to which they are subjected. But prolonging this resistance does not imply prolonging experiences of a dignified life. That is, situations that offer the opportunity to minimally exercise a set of capabilities valued by the birds. In addition, industrialized poultry is replaceable, which opens up the possibility of introducing treatments based on the elimination and exchange of batches of birds. If the poultry health problem happens to be highly transmissible infectious disease, such as influenza, the therapeutic repertoire could well be the mass elimination of countless birds, for which there are manuals with depopulation or extermination methods. Thus, the treatment of influenza in industrialized birds is very different from the treatment of influenza in humans.
We've definitely seen this play out in recent years, not only with the mass killing of birds during COVID-19. I mean, there were incredible images showing that, but also with the mass killing of both farmed and wild birds currently who are being affected by bird flu. And this has been an ongoing, I think, disease situation for years now, in which birds are being implicated as what you call the health apparatus.
Yes, it's important to note that a species-specific treatment has several justifications. The influenza subtypes implicated in most avian cases are different from the predominant subtypes in humans. The pathophysiological processes, clinical presentations, pharmacological responses, and epidemic dynamics also vary between species. But the differences in the treatment of influenza in industrialized birds and humans is due above all to the marginalization that turns poultry into raw material for the production of commodities. Here it is important to remember that health practices are normative, which means that they are exercised according to an injunction as to what should be done. Someone decides what should and shouldn't be done to maintain or recover health. Someone defines a norm that justifies and directs actions in the name of health. Marginalizing apparatuses greatly influence the establishment of health norms and practices and therefore health itself. In this sense, caring for the health of marginalized multispecies collectives implies taking a stance on what matters in terms of health and what should be done. In view of the plurality of meanings that health has, this position should also be multifaceted. Health has ontological meanings, whether as a state, process, or some other attribute of those who are or can be healthy. It also has epistemic meanings that define it, establish who can have it, who should have it, and how it should be cared for. It also has practical senses and concrete actions taken in its name. In the multispecies health that we conceive, the ontological dimension has collective and multispecies living experiences as its main element. Whatever the state or process, whatever capacities multispecies collectives become capable of, these are living experiences, and healthcare is an effort to ensure that these experiences are consistent with what holobionts value. The epistemic dimension of this multispecies health problematizes the apparatuses that marginalize through practices and discourses of health. The practical dimension consists of actions informed by knowledge of the pathological effects of marginalization, as well as the production of knowledge based on this action of peripheral resistance in order to break the margins and weave attentive relationships committed to what living beings value. These three dimensions are interdependent. Knowledge and actions, that is, the epistemic and practical dimensions, have a concrete existence. They are attributes of multispecies collectives. The knowledge and attributes of multispecies collectives are the products of actions. At the same time, knowledge gives meaning to attributes and practices.
Okay, so I think I'm following you. So the policies, actions, and decisions that industries, governments, etc. make when thinking about health, both discursively and materially, shape whose health is considered. And because species do not exist in isolation, when one species' health, like chickens, is instrumentalized for, let's say, economic gain, it can also impact other species and groups. So, for example, like you mentioned earlier, factory workers are more likely to be exposed to avian influenza and share higher risk, or, builders, like you mentioned earlier as well.
Yes, and not only whose health, but also what health. Many pathological processes are imposed in the name of health. Human workers suffer not only due to zoonosis, their exploitation is a condition of possibility for that economic gain. So far, I have been talking about the institution of norms that define what should be done to take care of health. And this might give the impression that both the establishment of norms and the exercise of care are necessarily human. However, if we rely on George Canguilhem's epistemological work on health, we can see that both the institution of norms and care are more than human. Any living being is, among other things, a complex and dynamic system that responds differently to particular circumstances. It has the capability to discriminate between elements of the environment in the sense of ability, of being able to do, and the capability to carry out this discrimination in the sense of opportunity. This discrimination gives rise to the possibility of choice, to a preference for what is most compatible with life. Thus, there is a vital norm. The living beings must be one way and not another. And as well as following norms, they have the capability to institute new norms to adapt to the dynamism of the environment, not just conforming themselves to the demands of that environment, but transforming it. Norms are followed in health and disease, but they are different. The normative capacity is greater in the first case, and this is what allows the healthy living being to face and emerge from pathological processes in which the norms are more restrictive.
What do you mean by normative capacity?
Normative capacity, which is inherent to the living beings of a collective, drives variability in ways of acting and relating, thus affecting the environment of other living beings and materializing collective transformations. Humans, with their remarkable ability to interfere in the environment of other living beings, lead them to establish new norms in order to adapt to these changes, but also pathological processes in the face of the impossibility of adaptation. It is in this context that I have placed health practices as a way of interfering in the lives of others and also as a normative exercise, since they are guided by a notion of health and prescribe what should be done to be healthy.
And I guess that these collectives are not only vulnerable ones, vulnerable collectives. You could intervene on behalf of a vulnerable collective, such as chickens and farm workers. You might also want to intervene and disrupt a dominant collective, maybe the pets, humans, and industries that rely on the production of those chickens. That's very interesting. Yeah, so it's kind of thinking about how different collectives operate again, scale, how different collectives operate in relation to one another. In your work at the collective, you have an explicit focus on decolonisation. What does that mean? So for example, you say that your network aims to decolonize health. What do you mean when you say that?
Yes. Modernity is a colonial order that proclaims itself to be the best, the inevitable universal destiny, the ultimate expression of progress. It is a Eurocentric ideology that presupposes epistemological and ontological superiority, as well as the obligation to modernize supposedly primitive and inferior humans, even if this means resorting to unlimited violence. In fact, if we think in terms of comparisons and identify as superior that which produces the most of a given thing, modernity coloniality is superior in a number of ways, many of them too problematic. No other civilization is as bellicose, genocidal, and destructive. None surpasses the records of the world wars or comes close to the scale of the horrors produced by Nazism, enslavement, or the industrialization of life that produces this category called livestock. The mass extinction of biocultural diversity and planetary climate catastrophes are feats that only modernity coloniality has managed to accomplish. The term Anthropocene helps us to think about some aspects of this modernity coloniality. The Anthropocene as a new epoch of human origin depends on one of the following premises. The first is that all humans, not just the modern ones, have caused the stratigraphic marks that distinguish the Anthropocene. Not only the owners of multinational corporations and those oppressed by them, but also indigenous peoples since the origin of humanity. It is a premise that doesn't fit with the evidence that points to capitalist extractivism as responsible for this new geological epoch. In this case, the Anthropocene is an expression that sums up the custom of privatizing gains and socializing losses. The second premise is that it is only the so-called modern humans who are effectively humans, and it is they who have left their mark on the rocks. In this case, those responsible for the depredation of the planet are identified most precisely, but only after excluding from the anthropos indigenous peoples and, in general, all those who don't have the presumed epistemic and ontological superiority. In this way, the two premises are symptomatic of modernity coloniality, which is responsible for this geological epoch that we could well call, as some do, the Capitalocene or Plantationocene. This modern anthropos, which creates subhumans in order to distance itself from them and rise above them, also inferiorizes other living beings in order to rise above them. The criteria of superiority that he chooses are precisely those that define and differentiate him. The criterion of superiority chosen by modern anthropos would never be, for instance, the ability to live for millennia without depredating large territories and commodifying life. This anthropos is trapped in a superiority-inferiority mentality in which progress to the top justifies anything. Thus, modernity coloniality is extremely pathological and lethal. If modern ideology is accepted, the only option left is to mitigate the damage of inevitable progress that direct and universalized by the white patriarchal anthropos of European origin.
Could you maybe be a bit more specific here? So I hear you in terms of the Anthropocene. It's a problematic concept because it puts the devastation caused on the planet on all humans, and that's not in fact the case. You have to look at these apparatuses of marginalization that you mentioned earlier. What is actually causing these challenges? And then you start to come into view very specific humans, very specific practices and processes that are responsible for a great deal of this devastation. But could you maybe give me some examples here about how this relates to health and health approaches?
Yes, in the field of health, there are several approaches that adhere exemplarily to modern ideology. One of these is known as One Health. It does not question the civilizational crisis of modernity coloniality and limits itself to mitigating actions that disguise and prolong this crisis. One Health is an ideological product that reinforces the colonial order in the name of universal health. Let's take a concrete example. The colonizers created medical and anthropological authorities and technologies to prevent the collapse of enslaved populations. In this way, besides legitimizing enslavement, they improved the health of the enslaved. They gave women psychological support so that they would be able to raise their children, that is, be able to reproduce the oppressed population. They looked after their diet and treat illness to maintain productivity. It was a health approach in constant search of physiological and epidemiological improvements compatible with the colonial order. Therefore, it did not contemplate the end of slavery, even if this led to a radical improvement in health. Similarly, One Health works to improve health indicators in industrialized animals, but without questioning the oligopolies that enrich themselves with agribusiness at the expense of food sovereignty and security. It seeks to reduce antimicrobial resistance, but without questioning big pharma. It proposes disease preparedness for emerging zoonoses with pandemic potential, but fails to denounce the capitalist extractivism that favors these emergencies, privatizes health systems, and massifies the poverty that prevents people from taking care of themselves and having access to quality health services. Something similar can be said of other action fronts. Although there are well-intentioned contributions in the name of One Health, and we ourselves have tried to give One Health other meanings, we have ended up concluding that qualifying health as something that is one is problematic.
Sorry, can I just clarify? By we, you're meaning your organization at the Multispecies Health Collective?
Yes. Before we start talking about multispecies health, we were talking about One Health of peripheries to give another meaning to differentiate our practices from those popularized by hegemonic discourses. But as I told you, we found that talking about something that there is only one is problematic. If there is just one health, then there's nothing such thing as health and one health, because there aren't two, there is just one. Moreover, when reviewing the epistemological literature, it becomes clear that there are many theories about the complexity of health, but there is no unified theory that synthesizes all the ways of understanding health. Among other things, because there are incompatible conceptions and not all of them apply to all living beings. In addition to epistemological diversity, health as a phenomenon is a different experience for each living being. There is not just one health, because every living being has singular experience of their own health. Nor is it possible to guarantee health for everyone, because the life of some depends on the death of others, and those who die lose their health. This last point is not to be understood as a license to justify any death. Moreover, one health as an approach and not as a concept of health is not the only one either. In addition to there being more than one concept of one health, other expressions have also emerged to deal with what is not covered by hegemonic discourses. One health of peripheries, as we did, structural one health, just one health, relational one health, more than one health, among others. Something that is emphasized in most conceptions of one health is transdisciplinarity and intersectoriality. But think of public health, new public health, collective health, community health, environmental health, planetary health, global health, eco-health, and many others. Transdisciplinarity and intersectoriality are inherent in all of them. So what remains to distinguish one health is the emphasis on certain relationships between humans, other animals, and environments, notably those having to do with zoonosis and antimicrobial resistance, without questioning the modern colonial order. However, these and other issues embraced by One Health are also addressed by other approaches, although not with the same emphasis. One Health has particularities, and in that sense, it is unique, but the same can be said of any other approach. Perhaps this is another distinguishing feature. It is the only one that proclaims itself to be the only one. Finally, it is worth mentioning another idea that is sometimes associated with One Health. Everything is connected, and therefore anything ends up affecting everyone's health. Therefore, there is just one health. As we know, the problem of this absolute relationality is that if something is everything, it loses specificity and becomes nothing. If everything is one health, it is irrelevant to say that you are working with it, because it is impossible for it to be any different. Faced with these conceptual problems and the universalizing ideology implicit in the idea that there is just one, we need to remember the multiplicity. As Deleuze and Guattari say, it is necessary to make the multiple, not by always adding a higher dimension, but on the contrary, in a simple way, with the strength of sobriety at the level of the dimensions available, always n minus 1. It is only in this way that the one is part of the multiple, always being subtracted from it.
Sorry, can I just clarify? When you say n minus 1, so n...
The mathematical notation, when you say you have n dimensions.
So you're saying a way of understanding multiple is saying, how can I understand the forest minus one would be, how can I understand the forest minus the trees? Or how can I understand a city minus one? How can I understand a city minus rats? Would that be how it operates, or is that a misunderstanding?
Here, the idea is that we don't need to always, once we have multiplicity, put it in a higher dimension, which is the dimension that unifies that multiplicity. Because when you do that, you, in a way, end up with that multiplicity because it is, after all, only one higher thing.
So multiplicity is inherent, like it's not multiplicity. Things are multiple.
They are multiple, and to think and work with that multiplicity, you don't need to put it in one unique thing. So that's the idea of n minus 1. We don't need to do that all the time. Of course, there's a space to processes of unification and totalization, but these processes are always partial. In that sense, there's no problem with unity, with talking about a total entity. But if we want to take multiplicity seriously, and this is why I brought this citation, we can do it thinking in multiplicity itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm with you. So instead of trying to simplify like One Health, trying to come up with a one answer fits all, this is the way it's done, we need to think with multiplicity.
Yes, and going back to the universalizing ideology, one of the things we feel with One Health is that any time that you do something dealing with humans, other animals, and environments, you automatically are put as a specific case of One Health. And that's an epistemic violence, because you are not allowed to see things differently. You are just doing One Health. That's the problem of always putting things in the higher dimension that unifies, universalizes. You don't have opportunities to do things different. And One Health, in its core, reinforces the separation of humans from other animals and from environments, when in fact we have many alternatives to think about the entanglements that make health and disease processes. We don't intend to make multispecies health the most modern and appropriate approach to implement on a global scale. Among other things, because globalization is the widespread imposition of modern provincialism. We want precisely the opposite, and it is in this sense that our aim is decolonial. It is an exercise of affecting and being affected in other ways, seeking to improve sensitivity in order to think more carefully about what is that we should care for and how we should do it. It is an exercise we carry out based on the relationships we experience and which situate us. What is health? Who can have it? Who should have it? How should it be cared for? Who answers these questions and who is listened to when they answer? When these questions are asked without reinforcing the supposedly inevitable progress of modernity, the colonial options open up for caring for multispecies health. This is what we try to do.
Well, it's very interesting work that you try to do. Thank you so much for sharing with me today some of your thoughts on multi-species health, on marginalized multi-species communities. Yeah, everything from talking about the connection and the challenges of thinking across species and individuals and multiplicities, to also being critical and political about the various apparatuses that work to marginalize and oppress, but also elevate and dominate. So to think about how various collectivities work together. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack, I think, in what you've said, and I think I'll be chewing on it for a couple of days. But why don't we turn now to your quote? Do you have a quote ready for us?
Yes, I have a quote which is in our webpage, the Multispecies Health Network webpage. Is in fact the last paragraph of the About section. And it says, multispecies health involves the colonial life experiences, understandings, and transformations. It is a praxis of actions informed by knowledge of the pathological effects of marginalization, which builds knowledge from those actions. It is an invitation and a choice to be and live differently, interested in the multispecies good life, which is a translation of a concept we use here, which is buen vivir, and therefore increasingly distant from the colonial capitalist modern center that provides comfort to the few, mainly white people, at the expense of the oppression of the many. Multispecies health is another way of multiplying the ongoing colonial flight.
Wonderful. I think that really captures many of the sentiments that you've shared with us today. Before we say goodbye, if folks want to find out more about you and the collective as well as the work you do, could you tell us maybe a bit about what you're working on now and how they can get in touch?
Sure. We are making theoretical work about meanings and practices of multispecies health. Most of our current fieldworks occur in favelas, in slums. One of them, for example, is multispecies ethnography about caged birds and how the metaphor of the cage helps to understand the marginalization of humans living in favelas. Another is about women working to protect dogs and cats in urban peripheries, paying particular attention to the challenges they face and even put their lives at risk. We also have studies about multispecies demographies in favelas, as well as initiatives to co-produce peripheral pedagogies with children and teenagers to imagine and work for other futures for their multispecies peripheral communities. One of the main initiatives in this context is a project known as Community Young Agents of Multispecies Health. It is based on actions proposed and carried out by a group of teenagers to look after their multispecies communities. We also have projects with laboratory animals, and one of our main objectives is to begin to work more and more with the ecologies of violence associated with agribusiness.
You said you work with lab animals. Is that doing experiments and tests on lab animals, or is that?
No. Precisely the contrary. Here in Brazil, the Ministry of Health has a network of laboratories to make diagnosis of rabies. And despite there are alternatives to do that diagnosis without using mice, they continue being used. And we want to figure out why this is happening.
Yeah, that's a really good example of one of these collectives, right? Dogs, the virus, the dogs, the virus, the mouse, the humans, the lab assistant, they all create a context that we can really see multi-species relations playing out. Well, thank you so much. I will make sure that the details for your collective are in the show notes so that folks can get in touch with you. Thank you for joining me on the show today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
All right, Priya, welcome back to the show. I'm very much looking forward to what we're talking about today. So why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much, Claudia, for having me again. So today, the story from my field note is about Sammy, a free-roaming pet dog who frequented the rural marketplace in Uttarakhand, India, where I conducted my PhD study back in 2023. Sammy's life and relationships will be our guide today through some of the multi-species collectives that composed everyday life in my field sites. A key focus in my narrative will be on the underlying relations, knowledges, and modes of engagements that give form to specific multi-species collectives. As I will show, considering everyday life as collective achievements can enable us to reframe health and well-being as inherently multi-species matters. I remember it being a cold November evening when Rajuji informed me that Sammy had fallen sick. I was standing across from Vinoda's butcher shop, observing the dogs congregating there in hopes of receiving the day's leftover meat scraps. I noticed Rajuji come out from the shop with something carefully folded in an old piece of newspaper. Rajuji is in his late 50s and runs a clothes shop in the market. When he spotted me, he walked over and extended his arms, proudly showing me the chicken feet that he had wrapped in a newspaper. They were for Sammy, a 5-year-old male dog with a smooth brown coat and lean muscular body. I had often seen Sammy sleeping or people watching outside Rajuji's shop. Every evening, Sammy and Rajuji visited Vinoda's butcher shop, where Vinoda kept aside meat scraps for the street dogs. On receiving his share of scraps, Sammy usually rushed back and sat at the entrance of Rajuji's shop where he took his time relishing his treat. That day, outside the butcher shop, when Rajuji told me that Sammy had not been well for the few days, he insisted that I come along to meet him. I accepted his invitation. Rajuji's neighbor Deepa Rani had once told me that Sammy's owner lives in a huge house that not far from the market. She said that Sammy had no dearth of food and comfort at his owner's home, but still he came to the market every day out of his prem, that is love for Rajuji. Sammy and Rajuji have formed what seems to be a unique bond. Every night at around 8 p.m., Sammy's owner comes to the market and takes him back to his human home. And almost daily, after breakfast and morning walk with his owner, Sammy is back in the market by 10 a.m., relaxing at his place outside Rajuji's shop. Sammy's owner does not especially like him spending time in the market, and they also blame Rajuji for keeping Sammy at his shop. But Rajuji told me that he never forced Sammy to stay with him. Sammy was free to roam wherever he wanted, but actually chose to spend time at his shop. Their relationship was not that of an owner and pet, but rather resembled that akin to a friendship. When Rajuji and I reached Sammy's human home, his owner escorted us to a detached room at the back of his house. Sammy was curled up under a blanket on a small bed on the floor. Rajuji bent down and whispered to Sammy that he had brought his favorite treats. Sammy sniffed the chicken feet but seemed disinterested. After repeated coaxing by Rajuji, Sammy eventually stood up and started chewing a few pieces. As he ate, I noticed he was having difficulty swallowing due to a gnarly wound around his neck. Rajuji told me that the wound was from his recent encounter with a leopard near the market. Incidences of dogs being attacked by leopards are not uncommon in this region. During my fieldwork, I heard several stories of people's pet dogs being taken by leopards. Close to sunset, I usually observed several free living street dogs congregating in the market. Ramesh, a local shopkeeper, told me that they banded together at night for protection from leopards. People also often planned their daily schedules and travels to avoid encounters with leopards. I was frequently advised to not stay out late in the market, and if that was unavoidable, then I was told to travel in a group for safety, especially during dusk and dawn, when the leopards are said to be most active. Even though their sightings were rare, leopards were often ever present actors in everyday discussions and activities. And this is for good reason. When I started my fieldwork, a local forest official had installed a cage in the nearby forest to trap a leopard that had attacked a young girl in the valley. While my field site was in rural Uttarakhand, leopard attacks are even becoming public concern in the state among residents in big cities such as Dehradun, Haldwani, and Nainital as they continue their urban sprawl and engulf the forest land around them. With the destruction of their habitats, increasing number of leopards are now found in cities, and this has resulted in heightened cases of negative human leopard interactions. One of the reasons leopards also come to cities is because it offers them easy access to prey that are free roaming street dogs. Rajuji recalled that on the day of Sammy's encounter with the leopard, he had seen him following some other street dogs outside the market. Later in the evening, when Sammy returned, he was badly bruised and could hardly walk. One of Rajuji's acquaintances in the market recounted to him that he had seen a dog resembling Sammy cornered by a leopard outside their house boundary. On hearing Sammy's squeals, he and his son came out to see what was happening. This had apparently scared the leopard, who fled the scene because of the commotion, providing Sammy the opportunity to escape. After our visit to Sammy, when Rajuji and I returned to the market, Vinota, the butcher who regularly fed Sammy, asked us about his health. Vinota said that it's taking a long time for Sammy to get better because his tongue must not reach his wound. It was locally well known that a dog's saliva contains self healing qualities. Rajuji agreed and said that Sammy can also identify and eat specific grass around the market that contain medicinal properties. But as his owners keep him inside the room, he must not be able to find the grass for himself. Once I started paying attention, I noticed grass growing all around the market. They even poked through crevices of shop walls and from in between concrete sidewalks. Mostly unmanaged and overlooked by people, these lively proliferations were often sought after by the dogs in the market. In the multi species collective of dogs, leopards, chickens, grass, and humans, living beings are connected to each other, for better or for worse, both in sickness and health. Sammy's health and well being also emerged from this collective. If Sammy's everyday actions of coming to the market are any clue to his intentions, for both him and Rajuji, their friendship was a source of mutual well being. Their relationship, however, sits outside normative understandings of pet ownership that dominate human dog relations. Sammy and Rajuji's friendship is one of those relationships that often remain unacknowledged in our societal norms. Other nourishing everyday relations that are often overlooked include the plants that often are removed as weeds, which might be important for other species. Being cognizant of which relationships are unaccounted for in a collective is important, as privileging certain species relations might have adverse impact on other species and their relations. This could be gleaned from the relationships of people and dogs in the market with chickens and leopards. On one hand, everyday mass killings of chickens in the butcher shops has become a cheap source of food for both rural people and street dogs. This arrangement might benefit some people and dogs, but it is also reliant on incarcerated, often overlooked chickens who spend their short lives in the cramped, unhygienic spaces. On the other hand, state protection improves the life chances of leopards in the face of drastic environmental changes, but it also produces risks for rural people and dogs who live in close proximity to these leopards. This is a reminder that life on a planet unfolds in everyday worlds with multiple species entangled with each other. Any actions pertaining to health and well being in our societies, therefore, need to be cognizant of this collective nature of our existence.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, the story is just, it shows the complexity of thinking across multi species lines, especially in some of the kind of political ways that we've been talking about in this season. And with regards to health, where do you intervene? Do you intervene on the health of leopards, on the health of dogs? Maybe thinking at the species level is not the right way to do it. We need to think about what current circumstances, what kind of relationships current circumstances are producing, right? And as you spoke to, their kind of habitat fragmentation is leading to, I don't want to say new conflicts, because I think, these are predator-prey relationships are not new conflicts, but different configurations between dogs, leopards, and humans are emerging now because of, yeah, like you said, drastic changes in the environments and in the ways in which they can relate. And I really like that you pointed out there that this relationship between Sammy and Rajaji, because there is a potential to be friends that's not reliant on this kind of resource idea. We tend to often think that dogs and humans are only friends because we can exchange food or comfort or security, but maybe, I don't know, is friendship, maybe friendship is a comfort. I don't know. I'm going on a tangent, but it's just really, really complicated and really interesting when you start to think in these collective ways. But it can also sometimes feel a bit debilitating, because if it is so complex, how do we act on behalf of or for anyone?
That's true. Yeah, I think like first of all, like to start off with, yeah, it is really important to look at our everyday existence and our relationships, like how we move around the world and our health as being entangled in these collectives,
Mm.
because we cannot dissociate ourselves from this larger, like inherently more than human world that's all around us, and we all have an impact on each other. So I think like an acknowledgement of this relationality is really key at first, but then just acknowledging that we are always in relationship with like each other as humans and even with non-humans is not enough, because then we have to think about the modes of these relationships,
Mhm.
because as you also mentioned that there have always been predator prey relationships. For example, like we have always more crudely, like we have eaten other beings, and other beings have like fed on us. But the modalities of those relationships and the power relationships in those relationships have been changing, the same way in which, for example, how we like mass produce chickens in chicken farms. That has not always been the case in history. People often talk about that, oh, like it's okay to eat chickens or like eat other animals because humans have all are omnivores and they've always
Mhm.
eaten other animals. But then, like, though you can't equate like the historical relationships or like more like cultural ways of relating, and like for example hunting, like with the same kind of like mass incarceration or factory farming that we might see.
Mhm.
So it's important to understand, like, yes, there are relationships, but yeah, how those relationships have changed historically,
Yeah.
and especially like, yeah, what other relationships would
And I
be.
mean, to build on that, the kind of intensity of the human wildlife conflict, but also the kind of leopard dog conflict and the proximities of different species to one another are changing drastically in a very short period of time. And like you say, this is a particular kind of mode of relationship that's happening very quickly and requires a response, or at least an acknowledgement that it's having an impact on varied health relationships. So, what happened to Sammy in the end? Like, did Sammy survive these wounds?
Unfortunately, after a few days after our visit to Sammy, Sammy passed away from his wounds. They were quite severe. However, like when I met Rajuji, and Rajuji told me that like Sammy has passed away, and I was quite sad listening to that. Rajuji told me to not be sad, that now Sammy would be reborn as a human. So there was this like cultural understanding that in the local like animist Hindu ontologies, that like dogs were one of the last yonis or stages, like crudely like translated, after which like they are reborn or reincarnated as humans. So like for that was a way for people to understand and maybe like grasp deaths, because deaths of these like dogs and these animals was quite common. As you said, like people often said that like leopards come in the form of death for these dogs, and this acknowledgement of being killed and dying. But then these relationships don't end with just like these forms of deaths, but they might be prolonged, because you might meet again. Rajuji told me that it's okay, like one day in the future in the market there would be a little child we'll meet, and he might be Sammy. We won't know. So for him, like the relationship had not ended. And I had often like one time I had overheard Rajuji talking to Sammy, and he was telling Sammy that this time, like in this life, I am feeding you all of this chicken, so, and taking care of you. So in the next life, when you become human and I become a dog, then you take care of me. So there was this relationality of care also that did not end with just this life, but it was something that, yeah, went beyond. And there was a local understanding of how people came to terms with these kind of
Do you
like
think that
precarious
prevents
working
people
conditions.
from intervening, like if they see a really sick dog um, who could be helped medically? Do you think that this understanding perhaps prevents people from intervening because they think uh, the dog will be reincarnated and death is accepted as a part of the marketplace?
Yes, so definitely. So it's important to understand this is a village that does not have a lot of medical facilities
Mm.
for both people or for other animals. The medical access is increasing, but it's still quite patchy.
Hmm.
So you won't get the same kind of, for example, veterinary services or care that you would get in urban areas. So people would try to look after the dogs, for example, and other animals. However, there was this acceptance that in the end, like if a dog, for example, like Sammy, who's suffering too much, like Rajuji tried to give Sammy medicines, he called the vet for Sammy. However, even after that, like Sammy's situation did not improve. He was still suffering. So his prolonged suffering and Rajuji's inability to help Sammy, in the end, like he accepted that, okay, this is the fate. And then, yeah, then these kind of rationalities come into play.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
there's something definitely important about focusing on death when we think about health. We often tend to conflate health with thinking about how to prolong life and how to live a good life. But there is something to say about the relationship between health and death and how to have a good death.
So just to add to that, yeah, as you mentioned, that death also being an important part of the conversation when we talk about health, because yeah, preventing death and prolonging life has also shaped how we have considered interventions in health. Uh, for instance, like if I think about Sammy, like if Sammy's owners did not, like they would have chained him at home, and they would not have let him outside the home. to like go visit the market and to visit Rajuji, he might not have been like attacked by the leopard, and he might still be alive. But then, like Sammy might not have had the kind of life that he wanted. Like his well-being was also intricately like bound up with his relationship with Rajuji, and he also like was friends with other dogs in the market. So, what is a good life? Or becomes like a more of like grappling with these questions of is just the idea of like insulating ourselves from like these risks and vulnerabilities of living in this like world where there are risks like in existing. Like how far do we go? And so that's a conversation that's really important, I think. And you rightly highlighted that. That's
Yeah,
a
it's
big
such
part.
it's such an important point, and I think we could talk about it for ages. I would love to do a season actually on animals and death, because it's a really important space, and we tend to try to avoid conversations about death. But like you say, avoiding all risk starts to raise these important questions about quality of life as well, which is really fascinating. As always, thank you so much for an amazing animal highlight. Thank you to Oswaldo Santos Baquero for being an amazing guest, to Jeremy John for the logo, Gordon Clark for the bed music, Priyashna the A.P.P.L.E for the animal highlights, and Rebecca Shen for her design work. Thank you also to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics for sponsoring this podcast, the Remaking One Health Indies project for sponsoring this season, and the Phoenix Zones Initiative for jointly sponsoring this episode. This episode was produced by myself and edited together with Christian Mentz. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Huttenfelder.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.